Darkest Dungeon 2 first released into early access on October 26, 2021, and was a totally new game compared to the original, with a new run format, new enemies, bosses, new run length, but the same old lovable characters. Well, some of them. It was in early access until fully released on May 8th of 2023, and throughout the 557 days from the start of early access and the end of early access, a lot changed, and for the better. But is it better than the original game? What I want to do is compare both games from anything you can think of: characters, items, bosses, difficulty, run length, anything, and then just see which game has more points in the end. Really, it's just going to be fun. This is all my opinion, so this is basically what I think. I do think I have a good history with this series, as I have 350 hours in the original game with multiple victorious runs, compared to Darkest Dungeon 2, where I have 85 hours across early access and 1.0. But I have fully beat the game as well, and unlocked a good amount, so let's fully dive into it. First thing we're going to compare is the insides of the runs. This is the basic stuff inside of a run, not fully everything, just the small little things. In the original Darkest Dungeon, you would travel between 4 main areas with the Ruins, Cove, Weld, and the Warrens. You would take 4 characters, load up on items like torches, food, anti-venom, band-aids, all the essentials, and travel through a procedurally generated dungeon while doing a goal like doing every room battle or exploring 90% of the rooms. And each location has 2 bosses. You unlock the more successful missions you finish, and each boss can be fought 3 times. There's also DLC in the original, but we won't focus on that. Now, go over to Darkest Dungeon 2, you still have multiple locations you can go through with the Shroud, the Sprawl, the Photor, the Sluice, and the Tangle, but you only go through 3 of these in a single successful run, with your end goal being the Mountain. Between each location, you can buff your team with items bought in the rest area, the inn, stock up on trinkets, equipable items, and stagecoach items, as the stagecoach is one of the biggest differences in between the runs. Now, here's what I think. I like both of these concepts for the run, but as of late, I've really liked the amount of prep available in a Darkest Dungeon 2 run with the inn. Being able to positively affect relationships, apply level long buffs, and easily stress heal makes the breaks in between the combat in Darkest Dungeon 2 more enjoyable for me. But that doesn't mean Darkest Dungeon 1 is bad in any way. I find the second just more fun, as the small insides of a run have more value to them since the runs are much shorter. You can't really afford to make a mistake. With all that said, the prep is nice, the quickness is enjoyable, but the true endgame in Darkest Dungeon 2 doesn't have that epic feeling in it compared to the original game. And if you don't know, Darkest Dungeon 2 is split up into 5 chapters, with each chapter having to travel through 3 locations minus the opening area and leading up to the mountain, which houses the final boss. And the bosses are hard and fun to fight, but even the chapter 5 boss doesn't have the same feel as the original game's fantastic endgame. We have battled through 3 incredibly hard Darkest Dungeon missions and then have an epic fight versus the final boss, who has 4 phases. Darkest Dungeon 1 executes the endgame better, as it feels you have a lot more on the line, since you have a whole roster of heroes compared to a 4-person run that if you fail, you just try again. The original game has you spend well over 40 hours in some cases training up multiple classes, fighting bosses, and learning so much about the game that when it's finally time to fight the final boss, it just has such a good endgame feel. Darkest Dungeon 2 is still a nice endgame, but it will never be able to top the euphoric feeling of winning your first Darkest Dungeon run. But one of the important things, if not the most important thing in Darkest Dungeon, is the combat. And if you're looking at both games, the combat does seem very similar. It's turn-based combat, with all characters being stronger in different areas and having moves that can only be used in certain spots. But when you play both games, you will notice some huge changes in the combat, and it's mostly with the tokens. Darkest Dungeon 1 has 18 tokens total that include damage over time effects like bleed and blight, riposte, stuns, guard, buffs, debuffs, etc. They're the little icons on the bottom of the screen. And in the original game, the way to buff yourself without tokens was with trinkets or upgrading your character's gear in the armory so they do more damage and take less damage. And I'll say the tokens as a whole in the first game are very easy to understand and learn. Now, for the second game, I like the combat just the same as the first game, as it's basically the same thing, turn-based, but I'll give it the edge with upgrades as a whole. During runs, you gain mastery points, and while you're inside the inn, you can use the mastery points to upgrade your move. They add a whole new level of strategy in figuring out what moves to upgrade and what moves to really use. But where the second game really struggles with me is the token system. I have 60 hours in this game and I do fully understand it, but I firmly believe this game has way too many tokens in combat and they're just all over the place. Darkest Dungeon 2 has a whopping 39 tokens that I've counted. Granted, some of them are exclusive to some enemies and heroes. Still, if you're a new player, it's very daunting at first, and the tokens just take over the battle, making it feel hopeless fighting some enemies. I love the combat in both games, but the simplicity of the token system in the first is my preference and really helps me like the first one more in this area. But of course, there's more to combat outside of tokens and buffing your moves. In fact, one of the most unique parts of this series is the stress mechanic inside of a run. In combat, you have 2 health bars to worry about with regular health, where if it reaches 0, you'll go on the death's door, and then you could die on the next hit. And then you also have the stress, which is if it reaches 100 in the original game, you either get a virtue or an affliction, with virtues applying buffs for the rest of the run, and afflictions applying debuffs. And in the original game, if you get the 200 stress, your character has a heart attack and is thrown on the death's door. Really, stress is one of the hardest things to learn how to manage in the game. You need to learn which characters can de-stress themselves or others, which trinkets will buff your amount of stress gained or lost, chances for virtues and afflictions. Really, there's a lot that goes into stress, and like most of the game, it's pure RNG if you get screwed or not. But the second game has a much simpler stress setup in my opinion. Now, I'll say the second game makes it a lot harder to heal stress and health, as you need to have a certain amount already gone on your character for them to be targeted by the move. But if you hit 10 stress, you have a chance for a meltdown or being resolute. A meltdown resets your stress to 0, lowers your health significantly, and lowers all of your relationships with other characters, which is huge. The second game introduced a relationship system where you can have characters be in a positive relationship with each other or a negative one, and if you have a positive outcome, then one of your moves leave a positive effect on the character they have a relationship with. The relationship meter makes me worry about stress so much more and makes me stay very focused on keeping stress levels to a minimum. But there's also one thing I never mentioned while discussing regular combat, which was held items. The second game also allows each character to hold an item they can use in combat. Items can be band-aids to heal and recover bleeding, buffs to your team, debuffs, and of course, stress heal, which can be used anytime. It's funny that the token aspect in the second game I find much more annoying compared to the first game, but I ended up liking the way stress is managed in the second game compared to the first. And at first, I didn't like not being able to stress heal or regularly heal at any time during the second game, but as time went on, I started to appreciate it more, as it really made me change the way I play to not just solely rely on certain characters to do certain things, like the vessel only healing. With stress being what it is, there is one thing that it can cause, and it's the end of a run if you're not careful. And this is a topic that is probably a huge reason why someone would not buy a game. Let's look at Darkest Dungeon 1. To win a run, you need to clear the 4 Darkest Dungeon missions, which are all level 6 missions. And once you have a character clear a Darkest Dungeon mission, they won't go back. So you need a minimum of 16 level 6 characters to win the game. And that will easily take you over 100 weeks of in-game time if it's your first run. My first run took me about 80 hours and 140 weeks total. You will make so many mistakes and you will lose so many characters, and you'll need to train up so many different characters through the levels. It's just a lot to learn, and it will take you a long time. My latest run in Darkest Dungeon, where I won a Blood Moon run and almost killed every boss, it took me about 95 in-game weeks, and I'd guess 35 to 40 hours, which is a very big commitment for a single game. Now, we can look at Darkest Dungeon 2, and the question is, what's a full run? Is doing 1 chapter a full run, or doing all 5 chapters a full run? I personally count 1 single chapter in Darkest Dungeon 2 as a run. You unlock new items, new paths for heroes which give them different starting buffs, and really just the meta progression as a whole. And every chapter minus the first one takes about 3 to 5 hours total, with the first taking I'd say 2. Even if we counted every chapter in a run and you won them all victorious in a row with 5 hours per chapter, it would only be 22 hours total, close to half of what a Blood Moon run took. Which, by the way, if you don't know, Blood Moon is just the hardest difficulty, Stygian with the Crimson Court TLC enabled. I like the length of Darkest Dungeon 2 runs a lot more, and after playing it, I'm more scared to commit to a full run in the original game, as it can just take so damn long. And we just talked about it a little bit in length of a run, but meta progression is a big part of roguelites, and Darkest Dungeon 2 has a more classic meta progression system compared to the original game. In the first game, you slowly upgrade the Hamlet, upgrading the stagecoach to have more heroes on your team, more recruits, and the ability to find higher level classes. You have the Abbey and the Tavern, which allow you to relieve stress after an expedition. You have the Sanatorium to remove diseases and negative quirk, and most importantly, the Guild and Blacksmith to upgrade your character's moves and base attack and defense. There's a few more things in the Hamlet, but I don't really pay much attention to them. You can upgrade all of them with gold and heirlooms you earn in dungeons. Compare that to the second game, where after a run you earn candles based off performance, and the candles allow you to unlock new characters, new trinkets for the characters, new cosmetics, new in items, new battle items, new stagecoach items, and allows you to unlock stagecoach buffs, pets, and even difficulty enhancers if you want. I love both systems, but the simplicity of the candles, it's much more appealing to me than the crazy amount of micromanaging you need to do in the first game. And for a first-time player, the candles would be much easier to understand. But here comes a huge part of the game if you were a giant fan of Darkest Dungeon 1, and it's the character characters. The original game has 17 characters, 18 if you count the Musketeer, who's just a reskin of the Arbalist, with 2 characters being DLC with the Shieldbreaker and the Flagellant. All of these characters in the first game feel incredibly balanced, and I'm forever impressed how well Red Hook made all of these characters so unique and strong in their own ways. I love finding new compositions to use in the original game with a whole group of characters I wouldn't expect. One of my favorites was a composition based on movement with the Jester, Shieldbreaker, Grave Robber, and Occultist, and sometimes throwing a Crusader in there for extra heals and stress. That comp is so fun, just having all your characters move around every single turn and dealing so much damage. Really, every character in the original game can be beneficial. You could say that the Antiquarian's the worst class in the game, and then I'd agree to an extent, but if you're doing a high difficulty run and need some money to help your economy, your best bet is bringing an Antiquarian on a few runs and using every single curio on her to gain as much money as possible, as with her in the party you can carry more money and gems. The characters are the heart and soul of this series, and in the second game it doesn't feel as fresh and balanced compared to the first game. The second game has 12 classes to unlock and play as, but is missing some fan favorites like the Houndmaster and Shieldbreaker, and we don't know fully why, or I don't know why, but I do like that you can fight the Antiquarian in combat in the second game, as she's one of the most annoying enemies to fight. But as a whole, the second game doesn't feel as balanced. I found myself taking a Man-at-Arms almost every chapter with how good he is with stress, heal, damage, and tanking, but I can appreciate the changes they made with the characters and giving them a much more in-depth backstory with hero shrines. That type of lore wasn't available in the first game, so it's nice to see the history of most of our lovable goons. The first game is obviously better in terms of characters for balance and total playable characters, but I'm not really all that upset with how many characters are playable in the second game. Plus, they also made a whole new character with the Runaway, who is very fun to play with. Of course, we have our lovable characters that everybody loves, but what about the other side of it? What about the enemies? Well, in classic Darkest Dungeon fashion, both games have multiple different areas to go in, with each area housing different enemies that are unique to that area alone, and then even their own bosses. I'm much more of a fan of the original game's enemies, as I find them to be much more lovable and memorable for me. Every boss, mini-boss, or random madman in a fight, they're all so memorable. The biggest difference for me is bosses and mini-bosses, as I don't think Darkest Dungeon 2 has many mini-bosses per se that you can fight. You can fight the Shambler, and every area ends with a somewhat big cultist fight, but those cultist fights never felt the same as a random collector or Shambler encounter in the first game. I can say the same for main bosses as well. I'll give Darkest Dungeon 2 the benefit with each final chapter boss. All 5 of those bosses can be incredibly hard to beat and will most likely wipe you at some point if you play. But the area bosses in the lairs aren't as memorable to me, but I think they can be harder than the Darkest Dungeon 1 bosses. So all in all, I believe that Darkest Dungeon 1 has more memorable enemies all across the board, but do believe the second game has harder bosses. That could be the 270-hour difference I have, but some of those final bosses in the second game are just so incredibly hard. And this can lead to what I think is the final most important difference, and that's difficulty of the game. Which game is more difficult to win? And really, it's hard to say, as there's so many variables that go into the game. The difficulty options for the second game go more in depth, I believe, than the first game, as every time you fail, you can equip a torch that buffs you for the entire run, which can be more beneficial compared to the easiest difficulty in the original game. But really, the game has so much RNG in it that it's near impossible to say which one is more difficult on paper. I will say it's more difficult to commit to a full run on the first game compared to the second based off length alone, but the second could be more hard to get into with the insane amount of tokens in the game and the insane strategies needed to kill some bosses. So the amount of time it takes to win every chapter could take as long as it takes a full run in the first. Overall, Darkest Dungeon and Darkest Dungeon 2 may be the same franchise with a lot of the same characters and similarities with health, dress, crazy looking enemies, but the games are so completely different, and I like that. I have nothing but respect for Red Hook Studios for trying something new with Darkest Dungeon 2, and even though it started off very poorly in early access, they stuck with it and really made a fantastic roguelike game that has insane difficulty, great meta progression, and very lovable characters. The updated graphics are also incredible. Granted, the original cartoon graphics are still some of my favorite of all time, but the 3D animations and all that, they look amazing. Both of these games have things better than the other, and you can make an argument for either one of them being better than the other, but it's really up to you on what you think is better. The second one could be easier to get into with the length of the run, less confusing meta progression, but the first one having more memorable enemies, more characters, and a lot less tokens, and being more balanced, it's really up to you. And for me, despite playing both of them a good amount of time, I will always like the first one just a tad more. It will always hold a special place in my heart as one of the greatest games of all time for me. Let me know which one you think is better in the comments and why, or why you may not like either game. It's a pretty hard series to get into, so I'll be curious on your thoughts. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure you like and subscribe if you liked it. It helps out the channel a ton. And an extra special shout out for the people that support me on Patreon still. Your support makes this content creation dream possible. So thank you for that. And well, I'll see you next time.